The room went dead silent the moment her sleeve slipped. 7 Navy SEALs, men who had survived firefights in places that don't appear on any map, stared at the faded tattoo on a nurse's forearm like they'd seen a ghost wearing the wrong face. Then the laughter started, low at first, then ugly. "Where'd you get that, sweetheart? Online?" She didn't flinch, didn't explain, just kept adjusting the IV line with steady hands while the mockery built around her like a wall. None of them knew. Not one of those decorated warriors had any idea that the highest-ranking officer in the building carried the exact same mark on his own arm. Before we go any further, if stories like this hit different for you, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The admission form said the patient in room 614 had sustained a gunshot wound to the left shoulder and significant soft tissue damage across the upper chest. Standard trauma documentation, the kind Delia Marsh had processed hundreds of times in 4 years at Coastal Pines Naval Medical Center in Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. What the form didn't say was that the man filling bed A had 3 commendations the hospital staff wasn't cleared to know about: a jaw like a hammer, and 0 interest in following instructions from anyone who hadn't bled for their country. Petty Officer First Class Ryan Holt made that clear within the first 6 minutes of his admission. "I don't need a drip," he said, before Delia had even introduced herself. "I need the pain prescription and a room with fewer people in it." Delia looked at his chart. She looked at the IV already halfway inserted in his arm by the admissions nurse. She looked at him. "The drip stays," she said. "You're dehydrated and your pressure is sitting at 110 over 68, which means your body is working harder than it should be right now. The medication doesn't work right if your blood volume is off." He stared at her. It wasn't a friendly stare. "You always talk this much?" "Only when patients try to pull out their own IVs." His hand, which had in fact been drifting toward the line, stopped. Delia finished the admission scan, noted the medication tolerances from his transfer file, and left the room without ceremony. She had 4 other patients on the floor and a post-op check due in 20 minutes. Coastal Pines Naval Medical Center was not a normal hospital. Tucked into a low-profile complex off the main Chesapeake Waterway, its trauma recovery unit, known internally as Block 7, handled casualties from special operations units across the Atlantic Command. The patients were not ordinary soldiers. Most had been through training pipelines that washed out 90% of applicants. Many had deployment records that were still classified. All of them, without exception, arrived with a particular kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with their physical wounds. The nursing staff in Block 7 was deliberately kept small. A smaller team meant fewer potential security gaps. It also meant that every nurse on the floor carried a workload that would have been considered unreasonable in any civilian setting. Delia Marsh was considered the most reliable on the unit, not the flashiest, not the most socially magnetic. But the charge nurses, and more importantly the attending physicians, knew that when something went sideways at 2 in the morning, Delia was the one you wanted standing next to you. She was 36, white, with short brown hair she kept pulled back, and a face that didn't broadcast much. She had been at Coastal Pines for 4 years. Before that, there was a gap in her employment record that she'd never been asked to explain, and that she had never volunteered to fill. She wore her scrubs the same way she wore everything else, practically, efficiently, without commentary. The SEALs in Block 7 had been there for 3 days before she was assigned to their ward rotation. There were 7 of them, recovering from a joint operation that had gone sideways enough to put the whole team in hospital beds, but not sideways enough to end careers. Room 614 held 4 of the more stable cases. Room 615 held 2 others with more complex injuries. The 7th, a man named Chief Warrant Officer Brent Calloway, had a private room at the end of the hall, and nobody on the nursing staff had been given his full diagnosis. Just instructions: monitor, minimize interaction, flag anything unusual. Ryan Holt wasn't the loudest of the group, but he was the one who set the tone. When Delia came in for evening rounds the next day, she found him sitting up with his arm elevated and his good hand holding his phone at an angle that suggested he'd been entertaining the rest of the ward for some time. Here she is, he said. The warden. Two of the others, Specialist Donovan Price and a larger man named Travis Oakes, looked up from what they were doing. Price grinned. Oakes just watched. Medication's due, Delia said. Mr. Holt, I need you to lower the arm for a minute. It's Petty Officer Holt. Your chart says Ryan. My chart can say whatever it wants. She moved to his side, checked the insertion site, made a small adjustment. He watched her hands with an expression that was somewhere between boredom and contempt. You from around here? Price asked from across the room. It wasn't a friendly question. It was the kind people ask when they're building towards something else. No, Delia said. Where then? Nowhere interesting. She's dodging, Holt said, apparently to no one in particular. Delia finished the check, noted the readings on the portable monitor, and moved to Price's bed. His wound was upper thigh, a shrapnel extraction with secondary infection that was responding slowly to antibiotics. She checked the dressing, noted no additional weeping, asked him to rate the pain on a 1 to 10. He said 4, which she adjusted to 6 in her notes because she'd been doing this long enough to know how men like him answered pain questions. You always this quiet? Price asked. Generally, yes. Bet you're a real blast at parties. She picked up the chart hanging on the end of his bed, made the notation, and moved to Travis Oakes. Oakes was the biggest of the three and the quietest. He had a shoulder injury, a torn rotator cuff compounded by some kind of blunt trauma that hadn't been fully explained in the transfer documentation. He watched Delia with an expression that was harder to read than the others, not hostile, not friendly, more like a man trying to work something out. She checked his range of motion response, asked him to raise the arm as far as it would go. He made it to about 40 degrees. She nodded, noted it. You ever do field work? He asked. It was the first thing he'd said to her. I'm a nurse, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. He looked back at her without elaborating. Your shoulder's improving, she said. Keep doing the exercises the physical therapist gave you. She moved to the door. Hey, Holt said behind her. What's the deal with Calloway down the hall? Nobody tells us anything. Patient information is confidential. He's one of ours. Then he'll tell you himself if he wants to. She left before any of them could respond. The hallway outside Block 7 was quieter in the evenings. The overhead lights ran at reduced intensity after 7, and the nurses' station at the far end was staffed by whoever had drawn the short straw for overnight prep. Tonight that was a younger nurse named Addie Nguyen, who was eating a granola bar over a patient folder with the professional focus of someone who had learned not to let anything interrupt a meal on a 12-hour shift. How are the new ones? Addie asked without looking up. Stable, Delia said. Holt's going to try to take his own IV out at some point. Put a note in the file. Already did. He asked me if I was ex-military when I did his intake. I told him I was ex-college and he didn't find it funny. Delia pulled up the medication schedule for the next round and started verifying dosages. Calloway asked for you specifically, Addie said. Delia stopped. When? About an hour ago. He told the evening aide to send the other nurse. I figured he meant you since you're the only other one on tonight. Delia set down the folder. Brent Calloway's room at the end of the hall was dimly lit and smelled like antiseptic and something else. Old machinery maybe, or some kind of accelerant. She'd noticed it the first time she entered and hadn't been able to identify it. The kind of smell that embedded itself in clothing and equipment over a long period of time. He was lying flat when she came in, which was different from earlier visits when he'd been partially elevated. His eyes were open but fixed on the ceiling. You asked for me, she said. Wanted to ask you something. His voice was low and even, the kind that didn't waste energy. Okay. The guys in the shared room, they giving you trouble? She moved to check his monitors without making a production of it. They're adjusting, she said. That's a diplomatic answer. It's the accurate one. A pause. They're not bad guys, Calloway said. They just don't know how to behave when they're not in an environment they control. Most people don't. She noted the readings. His blood pressure was slightly elevated for the hour, but within acceptable range given his injury profile. You've worked trauma a long time, he said. It wasn't a question. A while. Feels like it. She didn't respond to that. You don't talk much about yourself, he said. I'm here to monitor your recovery. I know, I'm just observing. He finally turned his head to look at her. He was somewhere in his mid-40s with the kind of face that had been through weather, not just time. Pale eyes, a scar that ran along his left temple in a thin white line. You were somewhere before this, he said. Before hospital work. Lots of people were somewhere before this. Not the kind of somewhere you were. She marked the chart and moved toward the door. Get some sleep, Chief Warrant Officer, she said. Calloway's fine. Get some sleep, Calloway. She was almost out the door when he spoke again. The tattoo, he said. She stopped. On your forearm. Saw it when you were checking the blood pressure cuff. Right side, just above the wrist. She didn't turn around immediately. What about it? She said. Nothing. A pause. Just noticed it. She left. She didn't go back to the nurse's station right away. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her back to the wall, breathing slowly. The tattoo was old, more than a decade, and faded enough that most people didn't register it for anything other than a vague geometric shape. A blade, interrupted. Medical symbols worked into the break. A coordinate sequence in a code that wasn't standard military issue, because it had never been officially sanctioned. It was the kind of mark you earned in a situation that didn't have a formal name. She pulled her sleeve down and went back to work. The trouble started the following afternoon. She was restocking the card outside 614 when Holt's voice carried into the hallway clearly enough that she could hear every word. Swear I've seen something like that before. Some civilian chick at a base outside Kandahar had one, but it was different. This looked more like the... You're imagining things, Price said. I'm not. It's on her forearm, right side. Delia kept moving the supplies. She stacked the wound kits in order and checked the saline count. Maybe she dated someone, Oakes said. He was the one who surprised her sometimes. Nobody dates into that mark, Holt said. She pushed the cart toward the door. The conversation stopped when she came in. All three of them were sitting up, which in itself was progress. It had taken Holt 2 days to feel up to sitting. But the way they were positioned, all angled toward the door, told her the conversation hadn't shifted naturally. They'd heard the cart. Afternoon round, she said. Hey, Holt said. His voice had a different texture now. Not contempt exactly. Something between confrontation and curiosity. What's the tattoo on your arm? She checked Price's dressing without looking up. Personal, she said. What does it mean? That it's personal. Is it a unit mark? She moved to Holt's bed and picked up his chart. No, she said. Looks like one. Lots of things look like lots of things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you ever serve? She noted the vitals and set the chart back. I'm a nurse, she said. It was the same answer she'd given Oakes. It worked the same way it always worked. Not quite a denial, not quite an answer. That's not... Blood pressure looks better than yesterday, she said. The antibiotics are doing their job. You'll probably move to oral medication in another 2 or 3 days. She moved to Oakes. His jaw was set in a particular way that told her he was listening more carefully than he was letting on. She was on her way out when Holt spoke again. If you've got a mark you didn't earn, that's a problem. She stopped, turned around slowly, looked at him. I'll keep that in mind, she said, and left. By the time she reached the nurse's station, Addie was off break and back at her desk, and there was a message flagged from Dr. Raymond Keller, the attending physician for Block 7, asking for an update on the Calloway case before he left for the day. Delia pulled the file and called his office. They spoke for 7 minutes about Calloway's recovery trajectory, the slow improvement in his mobility readings, and the question of whether to adjust the pain management protocol. Keller made a note. Delia made a note. The conversation was professional and efficient and completely unremarkable. But when she hung up, she sat for a moment at the station with her hand resting on the phone and thought about what Holt had said. If you've got a mark you didn't earn, that's a problem. She'd heard variations of that sentence before, in different voices, different rooms, different years. It never got easier. It also never got harder. It had settled into a specific weight that she carried the same way she carried everything else, without ceremony. The next morning arrived with weather. A low system off the bay pushed rain against the Block 7 windows in irregular bursts, and the fluorescent overheads, which always felt slightly too bright for recovery rooms, seemed harsher in contrast. Delia came in early because she always came in early and spent the first 20 minutes going through overnight notes before rounds. The first unusual notation was from Addie. Holt refused 2 a.m. vitals check, had to document refusal. The second was from the overnight aide, patients in 614 asking questions about nursing staff backgrounds. Unspecified concern raised Marsh. She stared at that one for a moment. Then she went to do her rounds. Room 615 was easier. The 2 patients there, a communications specialist named Farrow and a logistics officer named Beale, were both in more advanced stages of recovery and significantly less combative. Farrow was doing crosswords. Beale was asleep with his arm in a brace and his mouth open. In 614, the dynamic had shifted overnight in a way she couldn't immediately name. Price was awake, but not looking at her. Oakes was in the middle of a slow exercise with his shoulder and nodded when she came in. Holt was sitting with his arms crossed and his expression set like he'd been rehearsing something. She went to work without waiting for it. "I talked to some people last night," Holt said. "Blood pressure." "I want to finish what I'm saying." She held the cuff steady. "I'm listening." "I described your tattoo to a buddy of mine. Sent him a photo I took from the doorway." She kept her face still. "He says that marking doesn't exist in any official unit registry he has access to. He says the only people who'd have something like that are either lying about it or were part of an operation that was so deep it got buried. Or," Oakes said quietly from across the room, "they were actually part of it." Holt ignored him. "So which is it?" he asked Delia. She noted his pressure. It was higher than yesterday. "You're trending up on blood pressure," she said. "I'm going to flag it for Dr. Keller." "I asked you a question." She set the cuff down and looked at him directly. "And I answered it 3 different ways in the last 2 days. Personal, not unit issued. My history is my own. That mark belongs to people who—" "I know what it belongs to," she said. Her voice didn't shift in volume. It just got very clear. "Better than you do." The room went quiet. Oakes had stopped his exercise. Price, she noticed, had finally turned to look at her. She picked up the chart. Her hands were steady. "I'll have the blood pressure note in your file by 10, she said to Holt. "And I'd encourage you to stop sending photos of hospital staff to outside contacts. It's a security protocol issue." She left before he could respond. In the hallway, she stopped and let out a slow breath. Down the hall, the door to Calloway's room was cracked open. Through the gap, she could see the edge of his monitor, green numbers scrolling up in a steady rhythm. She walked toward it. He was awake. He almost always was when she came in. "Morning," he said. "How's the pain?" "Fine." "On a scale of 3, maybe 4. "Fine." She checked his chart. "You hear them last night?" he asked. "No." "I did." Holt was talking, loud enough that the words carried. She waited. "He's going to make a formal complaint," Calloway said, "about you, to the facility director." "I know." "You're not concerned." "I'm not," she said. Then, "I'm used to it." Calloway looked at her for a long moment. "I won't tell them what I think I know," he said. "That's not my place." "I appreciate that. But I'd be careful. Holt is stubborn and he's got reach. He'll make noise until something happens." She put his chart back. "Something usually does," she said. She was 3 steps from the door when all 3 monitors in Calloway's room screamed at once. Not the slow alarm of an irregular reading, the simultaneous, full-volume alert of multiple systems failing at the same moment. Blood pressure cratering, oxygen saturation dropping, heart rhythm spiking into a pattern that her training identified before her conscious mind finished catching up. She was already moving before the alarm finished its first cycle. She hit the call button on the wall, grabbed the crash cart handle, and was at his side in under 5 seconds. His color had changed. His eyes were open but losing focus, rolling slightly at the edges. "Calloway," she said sharp and clear. "Stay with me." His hand came up reflexively, and she caught it. "Something's wrong," he said. His voice was completely calm, which was the wrong kind of calm. "I know. I've got you." She was pulling his gown aside to get access when the door opened and one of the overnight orderlies appeared. She gave instructions in the flat, rapid language of someone who had run this protocol before, not as a simulation, not as a drill. And the orderly moved. Behind her, somewhere in the hallway, she could hear voices. One of them was Holt's, but she wasn't thinking about Holt anymore. She was thinking about the secondary reading on Calloway's oxygen monitor, which had dropped 4 points in 90 seconds and was still falling, and about the specific configuration of symptoms that pointed to a tension pneumothorax, a life-threatening buildup of air in the chest cavity that could kill a man in minutes if nobody moved fast enough. Dr. Keller arrived 60 seconds after she paged him. He took one look at Calloway, one look at Delia, and said, "What do you need?" She told him. They worked. Outside in the hallway, Ryan Holt stood in the doorway of room 614 and watched through the narrow gap of Calloway's door as the nurse he had spent 3 days dismissing worked with the controlled precision of someone who had done exactly this, in exactly these conditions, under circumstances he would probably never be cleared to know about. He watched her hands. He watched the way she moved. He watched the way Dr. Keller deferred to her calls without question on at least 3 separate decisions in the space of 4 minutes. The alarm stopped. Calloway's numbers stabilized. In the sudden quiet that followed, Delia stripped off her gloves and stood for a moment at the side of the bed. Her breathing was even. Her expression hadn't changed. She said something quietly to Calloway that Holt couldn't hear, and Calloway, who had been on the edge of losing consciousness 5 minutes ago, almost smiled. She turned and saw Holt in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she walked toward him, and he stepped back into the hallway without quite meaning to. "He's stable," she said. "I could see that." "Good." She moved past him toward the nurse's station. He stood in the hallway for another moment. Then he went back to his room and sat on his bed and stared at the wall, and didn't say a word to Price or Oakes for the better part of an hour. But the formal complaint was already written. He'd drafted it the night before on his phone and sent it to the facility director's office that morning before rounds. It accused Nurse Delia Marsh of misrepresenting her background through the unauthorized display of a military unit, marking she had no documented right to wear, and requested an immediate review of her credentials and a reassignment away from Block 7 while the review was conducted. The complaint was received at 9:14 in the morning. By noon, the facility director had called a meeting. By 2 in the afternoon, Delia had been told, politely and with deep institutional discomfort, that she would need to step back from Block 7 rotations pending a background verification. She listened to the whole thing standing in the director's office with her hands in her pockets. "Do you understand?" the director asked. He was a man named Gerald Fitch, and he looked the way people always look when they're delivering bad news they didn't generate and aren't fully in control of. Uncomfortable, but resolved. "I understand," she said. "It's not a termination. It's a procedural." "I understand," she said again. She walked back to Block 7. She collected her personal items from her locker. A water bottle, a small notebook, a pen she'd been using since her second week at the hospital that she'd never replaced because it still worked. She put them in her bag. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Down at the far end, through the small, reinforced window on Calloway's door, she could see the steady green rhythm of his monitor. Still stable. She turned and walked toward the elevator. She was 6 steps from it when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, Maryland area code. She answered. The voice on the other end was a man she had not spoken to in 11 years, and the first thing he said was, "I heard you're having a problem at Coastal Pines." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Who told you?" she said. "Doesn't matter. What matters is I'm going to be in Chesapeake Bay tomorrow." A pause. "Don't go far," he said. The line went dead. She stood in the hallway with the phone still against her ear and the elevator doors opening in front of her. She didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Then she stepped inside. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Delia stood in the small mirrored box of it, watching the floor numbers drop, and thought about the last time she'd heard that voice. 11 years. A debrief room in a building that didn't have a sign outside. Fluorescent lights. Paper cups of bad coffee that nobody drank. Okay. A man sitting across from her with a folder he never opened because he already knew everything in it, telling her that the unit was being dissolved, the mission record was being sealed, and her service, all of it, every month of it, was being folded into a classification level that meant it effectively didn't exist in any system she'd ever be able to point to. She'd said fine. She'd meant it. She had gone home, slept for 2 days, and then applied for nursing school because she still wanted to keep people alive. And that was the one thing that had always felt true regardless of which context she was doing it in. Now someone from that sealed, dissolved, effectively non-existent past had her cell number and knew where she worked. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the main hospital atrium, afternoon light coming through the high windows, the ambient noise of a functioning medical facility, visitors and staff moving in every direction. She walked through it and out the front entrance and sat in her car in the parking structure for a while without starting the engine. "Don't go far," he had said. She wasn't going anywhere. She drove home, ate something she didn't pay much attention to, and slept badly. The next morning, she woke at 5:15 out of habit and lay in the dark for a few minutes trying to identify what she was feeling. Not exactly anxiety, not quite anger. Something more like the specific alertness she associated with certain kinds of waiting. The kind where you know something is coming and the only thing left to decide is whether you'll be ready. She was at the hospital by 6:45 even though she was technically on administrative leave pending review, because nobody had told her she couldn't enter the building, and she had 3 patients in Block 7 whose recovery she was still tracking on paper, and the habit of showing up was stronger than the bureaucratic ambiguity of her current status. Gerald Fitch was already in his office. She could see the light under his door as she passed. She didn't knock. She went to the secondary nursing station on the Block 7 wing, not the main one, the smaller overflow station at the far end of the corridor that was mostly used for documentation during high-volume nights, and pulled up the digital records for Callaway, Holt, Price, and Oakes on the read-only terminal she still had access to under her nursing credentials, which had not yet been formally suspended. Callaway's overnight readings were stable. Oxygen sitting right where she'd want it, blood pressure normalized. Pain management protocol had been adjusted slightly, probably by the overnight attending, in a direction she would have recommended. Holt's blood pressure was still elevated, not dangerously but persistently, which in her experience meant the body was carrying something it hadn't processed yet. Could be physiological. Could be the kind of stress that came from being a man who'd spent 3 days aggressively building a case against someone and now had to sit with the results of it. She wrote nothing, just looked. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up to find Travis Oakes standing in the doorway of the nursing station in hospital socks and a gown, his injured shoulder slightly lower than the other in the unconscious compensation she'd noticed from the start. "You're not supposed to be out of the room without notifying staff," she said. "Technically, you're not supposed to be here either," he said. Fair enough. He came in and leaned against the wall with the careful economy of movement that injured people develop. He looked at the monitors over her shoulder for a moment. "Callaway doing okay?" he asked. "Better than yesterday." He nodded. A pause. "I didn't sign the complaint," he said. "I want you to know that. Holt drafted it. Price added his name. I didn't." She looked at him. "You could have pushed back," she said. "It wasn't accusatory, just a fact." "I know. But you didn't." He held her gaze. "No, I didn't." He didn't offer an excuse for it. She noted that. "Go back to your room, Specialist Oakes." He pushed off the wall. "For what it's worth," he said in the doorway, "I've been thinking about the tattoo. I've seen a lot of unit marks. I've been around long enough that I know the difference between something decorative and something that comes from a specific place." A pause. "Yours comes from a specific place." She said nothing. He left. She sat for another 10 minutes with the monitors and then went down to the hospital cafeteria and had coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since 4 a.m. and was perfectly fine. The call came at 9:52, same unknown number, same Maryland area code. "I'm at the main entrance," the voice said. "Come down." She set her coffee cup on the tray and walked back through the atrium. The man at the main entrance was not what she would have expected from 11 years of distance, which was to say he looked older in some ways and not at all older in others. He was black, early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone who had never fully stopped being in uniform, even when he wasn't wearing one. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, and a visitor's badge that the front desk must have issued him in the last few minutes. His name was Warren Lyle. 11 years ago, he had been a full-bird colonel attached to a special operations coordination cell that technically didn't appear in any public military organizational chart. She didn't know what he was now. She was about to find out. "Delia," he said. "Colonel?" she said, which she recognized immediately as a reflex from a different version of herself. "Just Warren," he said. "Walk with me." They walked. He waited until they were in a side corridor off the main atrium, one of the long, low-traffic hallways that connected the older part of the hospital to the newer wing, before he spoke. "I know about the complaint," he said. "I know about the removal from rotation. I know about Petty Officer Holt and the tattoo." "How do you know any of this?" "Because Brent Calloway called someone last night who called someone who eventually got to me." He said it without flourish. "He's been monitoring the situation since you were assigned to his ward. He had concerns." She processed that. "He shouldn't have done that," she said. "He disagrees, and frankly, so do I." They walked a few more steps. "What do you want, Warren?" "To fix this, or at least to do what I can before it becomes a permanent mark on your record." He paused. "Which it will, if nobody intervenes. You know how these facilities work. A formal complaint from a decorated operator gets taken seriously regardless of its merit. They'll run the background check, hit the classification wall on your service record, get nothing, and conclude that you're either hiding something or lying." "I'm aware." "Which means in about 4 to 6 days, this goes from administrative leave to termination recommendation." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "There's a review being conducted by Naval Special Warfare Command. Routine evaluation of medical support infrastructure at facilities servicing operator casualties. A senior officer is coming to Coastal Pines in the next 48 hours as part of that process." He paused. "I've been in contact with his staff." "You want to use an official review to I want the truth to be available when it's needed," he said. "That's all. I can't force anything. I can't override Fitch's process, but I can make sure the right people have access to the right information at the right time." She looked at him. "You've been carrying this for 11 years, he said. "The least I can do is make sure it counts for something when it matters." She didn't answer immediately. "Who's the senior officer?" she asked. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. "Go back to what you were doing," Lyle said. "Don't leave the area, and don't let them push you into signing anything before the review is complete." He walked back toward the main entrance. She stood in the side corridor alone for a moment, then turned and went back to the secondary nursing station, where Calloway's monitor was still showing a steady green rhythm, and sat down and waited. The waiting was the hard part. It always had been. The next 36 hours moved the way time moves when there's nothing to do but hold a position. She came into the hospital each morning. She sat in the overflow station. She read the overnight notes. She did not go into Block 7 because that was the one boundary she was going to respect, partly because she'd been asked to, and partly because she knew that walking into Holt's room right now would accomplish nothing except giving him more material. Addie found her on the second afternoon. "I want you to know the night staff is angry about this," Addie said. She was eating a different granola bar. There appeared to be an infinite supply. Like, specifically angry. Not just uncomfortable, but polite angry. "That's not necessary," Delia said. "It's not about necessity. Farrow in 615 told the overnight aide that you were the best nurse he'd had at any facility in 3 years of recovery. He wants to put something in writing. Tell him not to bother." "He's going to bother anyway. He asked me for the director's email." Delia looked at her. "People notice things," Addie said, "even when you act like they don't." She went back to her granola bar. Delia turned back to the monitors. That evening, Calloway asked to see her. She stood in the doorway rather than going fully in, partly a concession to protocol, partly because she wasn't sure what the right move was anymore and defaulting to caution felt safer. "You talked to Lyle," she said. He didn't look surprised that she knew. "I did," he said. "You shouldn't have done that without asking me." "Probably not." He didn't apologize. "I made a judgment call." "Based on what?" "Based on watching you save my life, and then walk out of this building the next morning with your bag and your notebook and nothing on your face." He said it plainly. Some people would have made a scene. Some people would have defended themselves. You just left. That's not heroism. That's just how I handle things. I know. That's why I made the call. She leaned against the door frame. Holt is filing a secondary complaint, she said. I was informed an hour ago. He's alleging that my response to your emergency was outside nursing scope and that it created liability for the facility. Calloway stared at the ceiling for a moment. Of course he is, he said. He's not entirely wrong on the scope question. I made calls during that emergency that I wasn't technically credentialed to make in this facility. You kept me alive. That's not how liability works. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at her. How are you doing? The question landed unexpectedly. Fine, she said. You don't have to say fine. Okay. A pause. I'm tired. I'm annoyed. I'm more annoyed that I'm annoyed because I knew this was a possibility when I took the job and I took it anyway. She shifted her weight. And I keep thinking about the fact that a man I work to keep alive is the one trying to end my career, which is a thing I understand intellectually, but still feels like a specific kind of betrayal, Calloway said. Yes. He nodded. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She didn't ask him how he knew that. She went home and slept, this time without difficulty, which surprised her until she realized she'd been waiting for something to move, and now something was moving, and her body had finally decided it was allowed to rest. The senior officer arrived at Coastal Pines at 10:17 the next morning. Delia was in the overflow station when she heard the change in the building. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, the way a facility responds to the arrival of significant rank. Footsteps adjusting, voices dropping or sharpening depending on proximity, a general reorganization of attention. She stayed where she was. Gerald Fitch's office door had been open all morning in the particular way that meant he was expecting someone and wanted to project accessibility. At 10:23, she heard it close. At 11:05, it opened again. At 11:12, the footsteps came down the corridor. There were 3 of them. Fitch, moving with the brisk energy of a man trying to look like he's not nervous. A uniformed aide who she didn't recognize. And a third person whose footsteps had a different quality. Not louder, but more deliberate. Each one placed with the kind of precision that becomes automatic after enough years of being responsible for things that matter. She looked up when they reached the doorway. The man was in his late 50s, black, with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had clearly made a great number of significant decisions without losing the ability to look like a human being while making them. 2 stars on his collar. The uniform was navy, immaculate without being theatrical about it. Rear Admiral Dennis Vaughn, Naval Special Warfare Command. The name Lyle had given her. He looked at her with an expression that was completely neutral and said, Nurse Marsh. Admiral, she said. Fitch looked between them with the expression of a man who had abruptly realized he was in a room where the variables had changed without his knowledge. You 2 know each other? Fitch said. No, Delia said. Not directly, Vaughn said at the same moment. Fitch's expression didn't improve. Vaughn stepped into the nursing station without waiting for an invitation. The aide stayed in the hallway. Fitch hovered in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or give them space, eventually settling on a position that was technically outside the room, but close enough to hear everything. I've reviewed the complaint filed by Petty Officer First Class Holt, Vaughn said. He said it the way people say things when they've read the document carefully, and want you to know that. I've also reviewed the secondary complaint regarding scope of practice during the Calloway emergency. Delia waited. I've been in contact with Colonel Warren Lyle, retired, who provided me with a set of documents that required my security clearance to access. He paused. I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer. All right, she said. The tattoo on your forearm. What does it represent? She held his gaze. A mission, she said. In Paktia province, 11 years ago. A rescue operation that went wrong in the 2nd phase and right in the 3rd, depending on how you define right. A pause. 4 operators came out alive who wouldn't have without the team I was attached to. 3 didn't come out at all. The mark represents the 3. The room was very quiet. Gerald Fitch had stopped pretending not to listen. Vaughn looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he unbuttoned his left cuff and folded the sleeve back twice. On his forearm, left side, just above the wrist, faded with the particular quality of ink that had been there for a decade or more, was a tattoo. Not the same tattoo, but from the same language, the same system of marks, the same mission classification, different operation, same war, same category of thing that didn't get put in any public record. Delia looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Coast," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "08," he said, just as quietly. "You were Paktia." 13. He rolled his sleeve back down and buttoned the cuff with 2 efficient movements. From the doorway, Fitch said, What exactly is happening right now?" Neither of them answered him immediately. Vaughn turned to look at Fitch with the particular expression of a man who has decided to be patient about something he finds mildly frustrating. "What's happening," Vaughn said, "is that I'm going to need to speak with Petty Officer Holt." Fitch said, "Of course, yes. I can arrange." "Now," Vaughn said. Fitch went. Delia and Vaughn were alone in the small station. "Lyle said you'd been carrying the restriction on your service record for 11 years, Vaughn said. There was no particular softness in his voice, but no hardness either, just the neutral weight of someone stating a fact. "The unit was dissolved. The record was sealed. Those were the terms. Those were the terms in 2013. Things have changed. I was told they wouldn't be unsealed without a formal review process. The review process was initiated 3 months ago," Vaughn said. "You weren't notified because we didn't have a current contact method on file." A pause. "Apparently you've changed your number twice." She hadn't done it to hide. She'd done it because she moved and it was easier. But she could see how the pattern looked from the outside. "The review is complete," Vaughn said. "That's part of why I'm here." She processed that. "What does that mean for the record?" she asked. "It means the classification on your service period is being partially lifted, not fully public. The operational details stay sealed because that's not something we can change without affecting other people's security clearances. But your service designation, your rank at separation, your commendation record, those will be visible to credentialing bodies and medical licensing boards." He looked at her steadily. "Which means Fitch's background check will not hit a blank wall." She was quiet for a moment. "That would have been useful 6 months ago," she said. "Yes, it would have." He didn't apologize. "I'm sorry it wasn't." It was a simple statement and he meant it, which she could tell because people who don't mean apologies deliver them differently, faster, more polished, with a slight upward inflection at the end that's really a question asking whether they're off the hook yet. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Now," he said, "let's go talk to Petty Officer Holt." They walked down the Block 7 corridor side by side. Vaughn's aide had reappeared from somewhere and fell into step 2 paces behind them. Gerald Fitch was coming out of room 614 with the expression of a man who had just had a very difficult conversation and wasn't sure it was over. "They're all awake," Fitch said. "I explained that Admiral Vaughn—" "Thank you, Gerald," Vaughn said, in the tone of voice that means you can stop talking now, and Fitch understood it and stopped. They went in. Ryan Holt was sitting up in bed. Donovan Price was in the chair by his own bed. Travis Oakes was standing near the window with his arms loose at his sides. Not relaxed, but not tense either. The kind of neutral stance that meant he was waiting to see which way this went before he committed to a position. Holt looked at Vaughn, then at Delia, then at Vaughn again. "Sir," he said, with the precise vocal adjustment of a man recalibrating fast. "At ease," Vaughn said, though nobody had been at attention. He looked around the room briefly and then settled on Holt with the patient, specific attention of someone who has a point to make and has decided not to rush it. "I've read your complaint, Petty Officer." "Yes, sir." "You have concerns about a marking on Nurse Marsh's forearm." "I did." "I do." Holt stopped. Recalibrated again. "It appeared to be a unit designation, sir, one that civilian medical staff wouldn't have access to." "You're correct that it's a unit designation," Vaughn said. You are incorrect about who has access to it. The room was very still. Lieutenant Delia Marsh served as a combat medical specialist attached to a Special Operations Extraction Unit from 2010 to 2013, operating in theater across multiple classified deployments. Vaughn said it without particular emphasis, the way you say things that are simply true. She separated at the end of her service obligation with a commendation record that, until 72 hours ago, was sealed at a classification level above your current clearance. He paused. She has not been hiding something she didn't earn. She has been carrying something she had every right to carry and no mechanism to prove. Holt's jaw moved slightly. He didn't speak. The formal complaint you filed will be withdrawn, Vaughn said. Not by me. By you. Today. He looked at Holt without anger, but without gentleness either. Because the alternative is that I file my own report on this incident, and that report will note that a member of this unit spent 4 days aggressively attempting to discredit a medical professional based on incomplete information and personal assumptions, and that his actions contributed to the temporary removal of qualified medical staff from a trauma recovery unit. A pause. Which reflects on the unit's judgment and mine. Holt said, "Yes, sir." Price hadn't said anything at all. Oakes, by the window, had the particular expression of someone who had expected this outcome and wasn't sure whether that made him feel better or worse. Vaughn turned toward the door. He stopped, turned back. "One more thing," he said. He looked at Holt, and then at all three of them, and then specifically at Delia, and what his face did in that moment was something that happened rarely enough that she didn't have a standard way to respond to it. He was acknowledging her, not performing it, not making a production, just seeing her and letting her know he saw her in the specific way that people who have been through particular things recognize each other without theater. "The mark she carries," he said, "represents an action that I am not cleared to describe in this room. What I can tell you is that it was earned under conditions that most people in this building, most people in this country, will never encounter and cannot imagine." He looked back at Holt. "The next time you see something you don't recognize, I'd recommend considering the possibility that you don't recognize it because you don't have access to what it means." He left. His aide followed. Delia stayed for a moment in the room. Holt was looking at the wall, not at her. At the wall, with the specific expression of a man processing a recontextualization that was going to take longer than the next few minutes. "Petty Officer Holt," she said. He looked at her. "Your blood pressure has been elevated for 4 days," she said. "I'd like to come back and check it this afternoon, if you'll allow me." A long pause. "Yeah," he said. His voice was different, flatter, less performance in it. "Okay." She left the room. In the hallway, she stopped and leaned against the wall for just a moment. Not dramatically, not in relief, just the physical acknowledgement of a very long several days coming to a kind of pause. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the end of the corridor at a low angle, the way it did this time of year in Maryland, and it put a long stripe of yellow across the linoleum floor. She pushed off the wall and went to find Addie to see what the afternoon med schedule looked like. Behind her, the door to room 614 stayed closed for a full 20 minutes, and then it opened and Ryan Holt walked slowly to the nursing station at the end of the hall, moving carefully because his shoulder was still healing, and asked the ward clerk for Gerald Fitch's direct line because he had a complaint to withdraw. He waited while she looked it up. He did not look comfortable. He did not look like a man who was done processing what had happened, but he asked for the number. In Calloway's room at the far end of the corridor, the monitors kept their steady rhythm. A duty nurse came in to check his vitals at 2:15, looked at the readings, made a note, and left. Calloway lay in the half-light of the afternoon window and thought about the phone call he'd made 2 nights ago and the chain of events it had set in motion, and whether he'd done the right thing by initiating it without her permission. He thought about her face in the moment she'd turned around and found him going critical. The way her expression hadn't changed, not a flicker of panic, not a performance of calm, just an immediate, practical engagement with the problem in front of her. He thought about the way she'd said, "I've got you." And then he thought about the message that had just arrived on his secure phone from a contact in the Naval Special Warfare Coordination Office. A message that had nothing to do with his recovery, or the complaint, or anything that had happened in the last week. A message that referenced an emerging situation in a location he recognized, involving personnel he knew, requiring a specific kind of medical expertise that was not easily found in standard military medical rosters. His eyes moved to the window, to the corridor outside, to the closed door of the overflow nursing station where Delia Marsh was currently reviewing the afternoon schedule, unaware that the thing Warren Lyle had set in motion by making his calls was not over, that it had, in fact, only just begun. The message on Calloway's secure phone was 17 words long. He read it twice, then set the phone face down on the bed table and looked at the ceiling for a while. 17 words was enough. People in his world had learned to be economical with language because language was a liability. Every word you put in a message was a word that could be read by someone you hadn't intended. So when someone in a Naval Special Warfare Coordination Office sent 17 words on a secure channel, those 17 words were doing the work of several paragraphs, and you understood that when you read them. The words described a situation, a location, domestic, East Coast, not foreign theater, a casualty scenario that was unfolding faster than the standard medical response chain could accommodate. Personnel involved, operators from a unit currently between deployments, caught in a training accident that had escalated in a way training accidents occasionally did when the people involved were running live systems under field-realistic conditions. And a notation at the end, 3 words. That was the reason the message had reached Calloway specifically. Need Marsh clearance. He lay there for another few minutes. Then he reached for the call button. Delia was in the middle of reviewing the afternoon medication schedule when Addie put her head into the overflow station and said Calloway was asking for her. She put the schedule down and walked the corridor, knocked once on the half-open door, and went in. He was sitting up, which was better than he'd been 48 hours ago, significantly better, with the secure phone in his hand and an expression she recognized from a specific category of conversation. Not an emergency. Not a request. The expression of someone about to ask something they know is complicated. Close the door, he said. She did. Sit down. I'd rather stand. He accepted that. I got a message an hour ago. He held up the phone briefly, then set it down. There's a situation developing at a training facility in Anne Arundel County, 40 minutes from here. She waited. A joint training exercise involving 2 SEAL platoons and a support element from a maritime interdiction unit. Live systems, controlled environment, the usual liability architecture. About 3 hours ago, a structural failure in one of the exercise buildings produced a collapse scenario that wasn't in the script. He said it flatly, the way people report facts that are bad without editorializing about them being bad. 7 casualties, 3 critical. The primary trauma response from the base medical unit is on scene, but they're under-resourced for the specific injury pattern. What's the injury pattern? She asked. Crush injuries, primarily. Some blast concussive secondary from a pressurized line that ruptured during the collapse. 1 operator with a penetrating chest wound from debris. That's the critical they're most concerned about. Delia was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because the message asked for you. She looked at him. By name, he said. 3 words at the end. Need Marsh clearance. He held her gaze. Which means someone in the coordination office ran the Block 7 roster, saw your name, knew your background, and made a call. My clearance is 11 years old. It's not active. The classification lift Vaughn initiated 3 days ago reactivated your access profile at the base level. You're not read in on anything current, but you have the baseline clearance to enter the facility. He paused. Which is apparently all they need right now. She turned and looked at the window. The afternoon light had shifted. Lower now, the stripe on the floor longer and thinner. I'm on administrative leave, she said. Vaughn is still in the building. Holt submitted the complaint withdrawal 40 minutes ago. Fitch is going to close the review before end of business today. You're not on leave anymore. You just don't know it yet officially. She turned back. How do you know all of that? Because Lyle called me when Holt walked to the nursing station. A small movement at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I've been getting updates. She stood there for a moment. The honest thing, The thing she would have told anyone who asked her privately, in a room where she didn't have to perform either modesty or capability, was that she had been a different kind of medical professional than she was now, in a different context, and that the skills from that context had not gone anywhere just because she'd stopped using them in the field. They sat in a specific part of her training like a set of tools in a locked cabinet, maintained by 11 years of hospital work that had kept her hands and mind sharp in the overlapping disciplines, and the lock on the cabinet was not a physical one. It was a decision. "I need to talk to Vaughn," she said. "His aide is in the main corridor. I had the duty nurse send for him while we were talking." She looked at Calloway. "You've been managing this since the message came in," she said. "I've been facilitating," he said. "There's a difference." "Not a large one." "Large enough." She left the room. Admiral Vaughn was in the main corridor near the nurses' station, speaking quietly with his aide. He looked up when she came around the corner, and his expression told her that Calloway had been managing more than he'd let on. Vaughn was already briefed. "You've heard," she said, 10 minutes ago. "I've been on the phone with the base commander at the training facility." He looked at her steadily. "The penetrating chest wound is the immediate concern. The base medical team has a trauma surgeon on the phone from Johns Hopkins, but he's 45 minutes out by ground and the patient is deteriorating." "What's the specific presentation?" "Debris fragment, left lateral chest. Suspected hemothorax with possible concurrent pneumothorax on the right from the concussive exposure. They have a corpsman on scene who's managing, but the corpsman is asking for guidance from someone who's worked this specific combination before." Delia thought for exactly 2 seconds. "I need a vehicle," she said. "Already arranged." He nodded to the aide. "Petty Officer Reyes will drive you. I'll call ahead so you clear the facility gate without delay." "I need a kit. Trauma-specific, not standard nursing. Chest decompression supplies, thoracostomy capability, blood products if the facility can provide them." "The base has blood products. I've already authorized access." She was moving while he was finishing the sentence. She went to the supply room off Block 7. She still had access, she'd checked that morning, and pulled what she needed with the rapid, non-deliberating efficiency of someone who has packed emergency kits in the dark under conditions that made this seem easy. She was out the door of the supply room in under 4 minutes. Addie was in the hallway. "I heard," Addie said. "Cover the evening rounds." "Already on it." A pause. "Come back." It wasn't sentimental, it was practical. Addie said it the way you say things to someone you work with in a place where the work sometimes puts people at risk, and you want them to know you're tracking their return as a professional necessity. "I'll be back for morning rounds," Delia said. She went. The drive to Anne Arundel County took 38 minutes. Petty Officer Reyes drove with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been asked to move fast without attracting attention many times before, and Delia spent the time going through the kit she'd assembled and filling in gaps with what Reyes had in the vehicle's medical bag, a more comprehensive kit than standard issue, which told her that Vaughn had been ahead of this in some way she didn't fully understand yet. She didn't ask. She organized, verified, mentally reviewed the presentation Vaughn had described. Hemothorax plus suspected concurrent pneumothorax was a workable combination if you caught it at the right point. The window was not infinite. The corpsman managing on scene was doing something right because the patient was deteriorating but not crashing, which meant he'd been making good calls under pressure without overreaching his scope. The training facility was a low-profile complex inside a larger federal property, the kind of place that appeared on satellite imagery as a series of unremarkable structures but had a perimeter gate, a guard shack, and a vehicle barrier system that went up automatically when the facility was in an elevated security status. It was currently elevated. Reyes spoke into a handset at the gate. 30 seconds later, the barrier came down and they went through. The collapse site was in the northeast quadrant of the facility, a 3-story structure used for urban operations training that had partially pancaked on one side when a supporting column failed. She could see it from the road inside the facility, the distinctive topography of a partial structural collapse. One corner of the building dropped and folded, the rest standing at an angle that looked wrong in a way your eyes registered before your brain caught up. Emergency vehicles were positioned at the perimeter of the collapse zone. A triage area had been established on the flat ground to the east. She could see at least 2 operators on stretchers, a third being manually stabilized by people in medical vests, and further back, partially screened by a vehicle, a fourth who wasn't moving. Reyes stopped the vehicle, and she was out before it fully stopped. The base medical officer, a Navy lieutenant named Okoro, who introduced himself in 3 words and then got straight to the point, met her at the edge of the triage area. "The chest wound is here," he said, already turning and walking. "Corpsman Ferris has been on him for 20 minutes. He's been maintaining, but we're watching the SAT drop. Currently at 89. 89 was not a number you watched for very long without doing something about it." "What's been done?" she asked, moving with him. "Needle decompression on the right 6 minutes ago. Gave him some relief, but not sustained. We think the left hemothorax is the primary now, but Ferris wasn't comfortable with the thoracostomy without backup. He was right not to be." They reached the patient. The corpsman, Ferris, young, somewhere in his mid-20s, with the specific expression of someone holding a situation together through concentration alone, looked up when she came in, and the relief in his eyes was not the relief of someone who was passing responsibility. It was the relief of someone who had been working hard and just got support. "What's your read?" she said, crouching beside the patient. He gave it to her in 30 seconds. Clear, organized, no editorializing. Mechanism of injury, initial assessment, interventions, current vitals, trends. She listened, checked the patient herself with hands and eyes, noted the reduced breath sounds on the left that confirmed what Ferris had suspected. The patient was conscious, which was both good and complicated. He was a large man. She put him at 220, heavily muscled, with a fragment wound in the left lateral chest that was smaller than it looked, which was always the worst kind. Small entry, significant interior damage. His eyes were tracking, but his color wasn't right, and his breathing had the specific labored quality of a chest that was losing the pressure differential it needed to keep the lungs inflating properly. "I'm going to drain the left side," she said. "You've got everything out that I'll need?" "Yes, ma'am," Ferris said. He was already repositioning. "Talk to him," she said. "Keep him present." Ferris moved to the patient's head. "Specialist Devereaux," he said in the even anchor voice tone that good corpsmen learned. "This is going to get better in about 2 minutes. Stay with me." Devereaux, the patient, said something that was partially intelligible and partially not. The intelligible part was unprintable. Ferris absorbed it without reaction. Delia worked. The thoracostomy was not a simple procedure in any context. In a field environment, kneeling on ground that wasn't level, with emergency lighting and the ambient noise of a rescue operation, it required a specific kind of cognitive narrowing. The ability to reduce the entire universe to the task immediately in front of you while simultaneously tracking vitals, team positioning, equipment status, and the dozen small signals the patient's body was sending about how much time you had. She had been doing this, in one form or another, for a long time, not smoothly. Her first incision went slightly deeper than ideal because the patient moved, a reflex, not a decision, and she adjusted. There was more blood than she'd have wanted. Ferris called out the SAT at the 2-minute mark, still 89, which was holding at least. Then the drain went in and the pressure shifted and the patient's next breath was different, perceptibly, audibly different, and his SAT began to climb. 90, 92. She held the position, monitoring. "Good," Ferris said, and she could hear the controlled exhale in the word. "Watch the rate," she said. "I want to see sustained improvement before we talk about moving him." "Copy." Lieutenant Okoro had been standing back, managing the larger triage picture. He came forward now. "2 others," he said. "Crush injuries, both lower extremities. Our team has them stabilized, but one is going to need a vascular consult. I'm worried about compartment syndrome developing in the left leg." "Who's the furthest along?" "Operator named Sills, left lower leg. Pressure was borderline 20 minutes ago when we last checked." "Check it again now." He went. Delia kept her attention on Devereaux. His color was improving incrementally. Still not right, but moving in the correct direction. Ferris was monitoring the drain, noting the output volume, and making observations aloud that told her he was genuinely good at this, that the 20 minutes he'd spent managing alone before she arrived had been good minutes. "You did well before I got here," she said. "I almost did the thoracostomy myself," he said. "Wasn't sure." "You made the right call. Calling for help when you're at the edge of your capability is a skill." Doesn't feel like one. Never does. Okoro came back. The pressure reading in Sills's left compartment had risen to a level that answered the question. He needs a fasciotomy, she said. I know, I can perform it, but I haven't done one in the field since. It's been a while. Walk me through your approach, and I'll monitor. They worked on Sills while Ferris maintained Devro. It was the kind of situation that required the specific management skill of being in two places almost simultaneously. She moved between the two patients on a cycle that kept getting shorter as the situations developed. And there were several moments where she had to make real-time decisions about which one needed her more in a given 30-second window. The fasciotomy was textbook. Okoro was better than he'd given himself credit for, which was a pattern she'd noticed across her career. People in high-pressure situations often undersold their own capability because the pressure made everything feel harder than it was, and the feeling of difficulty became indistinguishable from actual inadequacy. You've got it, she told him. Finish. He finished. By the time the Johns Hopkins surgeon arrived, 43 minutes after she'd been told 45, which was better than promised, she had Devro stabilized, Sills's compartment pressure managed, and the third critical patient, a woman named Torino with a significant concussive blast injury and secondary lacerations, assessed and treated to the point where she was alert, oriented, and giving the medical team a detailed and profane account of what she remembered about the collapse. The surgeon, tall, 50s, wearing civilian clothes with a trauma credential badge clipped to his jacket, came in fast and went straight to Devro. He assessed, made some sounds that were not quite words, looked at the drain, the positioning, the vitals record that Ferris had been keeping on a notepad with the kind of meticulous handwriting you developed when you learned that bad documentation got people killed. He looked up at Delia. Who placed this? He said. I did. He looked at her credentials. You're a nurse, he said. I am. He looked at the drain again. Placement is perfect, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was the specific acknowledgement of someone who knows what they're looking at and has no reason to be anything other than accurate about it. Thank you, she said. We need to transport. I want him in a surgical suite in the next 40 minutes. He's stable for transport. Agreed. He looked at Okoro. The fasciotomy patient? Stable, Okoro said. Needs imaging and vascular follow-up, but he's not in immediate danger. Good work, the surgeon said to Okoro, then to Ferris, then, with the same neutral, professional acknowledgement, to Delia. Ferris, she noticed, looked at her when the surgeon said it, and there was something in his expression that wasn't deference. It was more like recognition. The specific look of a younger person who has worked beside someone competent under pressure and has updated their understanding of what competence looks like. The transport vehicles arrived. Patients were moved. Okoro handled the handover documentation while Ferris restocked the kit and Delia walked a slow perimeter of the triage site, checking for anything that had been missed in the intensity of the last 90 minutes. Nothing missed. She stopped at the edge of the collapse zone and looked at the building. The structural failure was more extensive than she'd understood from the vehicle. Not just the one corner, but a progressive compromise that had caught the exercise team in a bad position at a bad moment. The kind of thing that happened rarely enough that people stopped expecting it. And then it happened. She thought about the 3 men and 2 women who'd been inside when it went. She thought about the margin, the specific, unglamorous arithmetic margin between the outcome they'd gotten and the outcome they'd nearly gotten. Then she turned and went back to where Reyes had the vehicle idling. She was most of the way there when her phone rang. Vaughn. Update, he said. 3 critical stable for transport, 2 moderate, managed on scene, no fatalities. A pause. Good, he said. The word had more weight in it than its size suggested. Come back to Coastal Pines when you're done there. There's something I need to discuss with you. Can it wait until morning? It can, but I'd prefer tonight. She got in the vehicle. Reyes drove. On the way back, she sat with the window cracked despite the cold, because after 90 minutes of controlled intensity, the air tasted like something she needed. The lights of the Anne Arundel corridor moved past. Highway exits, gas stations, the flat dark of commercial parking structures at night. And she let her mind go quiet for a few minutes because that was the only maintenance she'd ever found that actually worked. She thought about Ferris, About his 30-second assessment at the patient's side that had been organized and accurate and completely without self-promotion. She thought about Okoro's hands during the fasciotomy, steady once he'd gotten past the initial uncertainty, doing the work correctly. She thought about Devereaux's face when his next breath had been easier. She did not think about whether she was supposed to be doing this, or what her employment status was, or what Gerald Fitch would say when he found out where she'd spent the afternoon. Those were real considerations, and she'd deal with them in the morning. Coastal Pines came up on the right 40 minutes later. Reyes pulled into the medical complex, and she was out of the vehicle and through the main entrance before she'd fully decided what she was going to say to Vaughn. He was in the main corridor outside Block 7, which told her he'd been waiting closer to the unit than his office would have been, which told her something about the conversation they were about to have. Fitch closed the administrative review at 5:40, he said. You're cleared for full return to rotation as of tomorrow morning. All right. I also spoke to the base commander at the facility. He wants to put your contribution today in the operational record. I'd rather he didn't. I know. He studied her. He's going to anyway. Some things you don't get to decline. She accepted that. What did you need to discuss? She asked. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who is about to change the subject in a way that isn't actually a change of subject. 6 months ago, he said, a proposal was submitted to Naval Special Warfare Command to create a dedicated advanced trauma support role embedded in facilities like this one. Not a physician, not a standard nursing role. Something in between. A specialist with field medical experience who can bridge the gap between hospital-grade care and operator-specific trauma scenarios. He paused. The proposal was approved 3 weeks ago. We've been looking for the right person to pilot the role. She looked at him. The events of the last 4 days, he said, and the events of this afternoon have removed any ambiguity about who that person is. The corridor was quiet. Down at the far end, she could see the light in the overflow nursing station where she'd spent the last several days in administrative limbo, monitoring charts that weren't technically her responsibility and waiting for something to resolve. I'd need to know the full scope of the role before I said yes to anything, she said. Of course. And I'd need it in writing, obviously. And I'd need to finish Calloway's recovery before I transitioned out of my current caseload. He still has at least 3 weeks, Vaughn said. I know. I've read his file. She looked at him. Is that a yes? He said. She started to answer. And then, from Block 7, specifically from Room 614, there was a sound that both of them recognized before they'd consciously processed what it was. Not an alarm, not a crash, a voice. Ryan Holt's voice from inside the room, speaking with a controlled urgency that had nothing theatrical in it. I need somebody in here. Oakes is down. She was already moving. She hit the door to 614 and was inside in 2 seconds, and Travis Oakes was on the floor between his bed and the window, not unconscious but close, his right arm braced under him at an angle that suggested he'd tried to catch himself and couldn't, his face wrong in the particular way faces go wrong when something neurological is happening. Ryan Holt was out of his own bed, which he was not supposed to be, which he clearly did not care about, crouching beside Oakes with his good hand on Oakes's shoulder and his injured shoulder held carefully at a fixed angle that told her he'd moved fast and was managing the pain of it. He just dropped, Holt said. He was standing, and then he wasn't. How long? 40 seconds, less. She was already assessing. Oakes's eyes were present, but not fully tracking. Left side of his face had a subtle asymmetry that hadn't been there before. She took his wrist and felt his pulse, irregular in a specific way that sent a cold, clear current of recognition through her. What's his cardiac history? She said to Holt, not because she expected him to know, but because sometimes people knew things you hadn't expected. He mentioned once his dad had a heart thing. I don't know. She hit the call button on the wall, looked at Oakes. Travis, she said, can you hear me? His eyes moved to her face. Yeah, he said. It came out slurred at the edges. I need you to squeeze my hand. He tried. Right hand was fine. Left hand produced nothing. She stood up and looked at Holt. Get back in your bed, she said. Get back in your bed and don't get out again. He got back in his bed. The duty nurse appeared in the doorway and Delia gave her 30 words that dispatched her back down the corridor at speed. Then she turned back to Oakes and the monitor readings that were telling her what she already suspected, and she thought about the fact that Oakes was 38 years old and that neurological events in 38-year-old men with no documented cardiac history and a shoulder injury that had been described as blunt trauma were not always what they first appeared, and that the blunt trauma notation in his transfer documentation that had never been fully explained to her was suddenly something she needed explained. She pulled out his chart. She found the gap in the documentation. She found what had been omitted from the original transfer records, not deliberately, she thought, but in the compressed, incomplete way that transfer documentation sometimes arrived when the unit sending it was more focused on getting the patient moved than on providing full context. Oakes hadn't just sustained a shoulder injury in the operation. He'd taken a direct impact to the chest. Blunt force, the kind of thing that could disrupt cardiac rhythm in ways that didn't always present immediately. The kind of thing called commotio cordis in the textbooks, or its slower onset cousin, which was cardiac contusion. Bruising of the heart muscle that could sit quiet for days before it decided not to be quiet anymore. She looked at him on the floor. She looked at the monitor readings. She looked at the chart. Behind her, Holt was very still in his bed, watching her with an expression she didn't have time to read. She picked up the call button again and upgraded the emergency level. And while she waited for the team to respond, she crouched back down beside Oakes and put her hand on his arm, because the monitoring was happening, and the team was coming, and the thing he needed most in the next 90 seconds was to not feel alone on the floor. "Still with me?" she said. "Yeah," Oakes said. His voice was clearer than it had been 20 seconds ago, which was ambiguous. Could be good, could be the particular false clarity that preceded something worse. "Good," she said. "Keep talking to me." "About what?" "Anything." A pause. "I knew," he said, "from the first day." His voice was slow and effortful. "The way you moved, in this room. I knew you weren't just a nurse." "I am a nurse," she said. "Not just," he said. The team came through the door. She stood and stepped back and gave her assessment in 25 words, and watched them work and thought about the cardiac contusion, and about the blunt trauma notation, and about the fact that whatever happened in the next 10 minutes would tell her whether the gap in Oakes's transfer documentation was going to cost him something he couldn't get back. The cardiac monitor spiked. The cardiac monitor spiked, and then the room became the kind of controlled chaos that looks from the outside like disorder, but is, from the inside, a set of very fast parallel decisions being made by people who know what they're doing. The duty nurse, Torres, who Delia had worked with enough times to trust without having to think about it, moved to the crash cart without being told. The overnight attending doctor, Priya Nambiar, came through the door 40 seconds after the page, assessed the monitor in one look, and said to Delia, "What am I looking at?" "Probable cardiac contusion, missed on transfer documentation. He took a direct chest impact in theater. I found it in the notes after the event presented." Delia said it without softening it, because Nambiar didn't need softening, she needed information. "He's been in this facility for 6 days with undetected myocardial bruising. The rhythm disturbance you're seeing is consistent with delayed onset arrhythmia secondary to that." Nambiar looked at the monitor, looked at Oakes, looked at the chart that Delia was holding out to her. "Okay," Nambiar said, which was the single most efficient word a physician could say in that moment, and she took the chart and went to work. Oakes was still conscious. His face was the color of old concrete and the left side asymmetry had faded somewhat, which suggested the earlier presentation had been vagal rather than ischemic, a distinction that mattered enormously for what came next. He was tracking Delia with his eyes in the specific way that patients track the person in the room they've decided is their anchor, which was its own kind of information. "You're going to be moved to the cardiac unit," Delia told him. "They're going to run an echo and an extended rhythm strip, and they're going to figure out exactly what the contusion looks like and how to manage it." "Not the worst thing," he said. His voice was slow, but his eyes were sharper than they'd been 5 minutes ago. "It's not. Holt's going to be insufferable about this." She looked over at Holt's bed. He was sitting up with his arms crossed and an expression that was somewhere between genuinely shaken and working hard not to show it. "Probably," she said. They moved Oakes 12 minutes later. The transport team came in, efficient and brisk, and got him on the gurney with the particular practiced economy of people who have moved injured patients through narrow corridors many times. Nambiar went with them. Torres cleared the equipment, and then room 614 was quieter than it had been at any point in the last 6 days. Price was in his bed looking at the ceiling. Holt was looking at the doorway where Oakes had just been taken through. Delia stood near the window, reviewing the transfer notes she'd marked. The gap, the omission, the blunt trauma notation that should have triggered a cardiac screening on admission and hadn't. "He's going to be okay," Holt said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement men make when they need the answer to be yes and are trying to pre-create that reality. "He should be," she said. "If the contusion is what I think it is, and there's no arterial involvement, it's manageable with monitoring and medication adjustment." "Should be," he repeated. "I don't do guarantees." He absorbed that, looked at his hands for a moment. "The transfer documentation," he said. "The gap you found. That's on the sending unit's medical staff? It's on whoever completed the form, which is the base at wherever they came in from." "Yes." He went quiet again. She could see him working through something. "If that gap gets flagged," he said carefully, "it's going to go back to the unit medical officer who signed off on the transfer." "It will," she said, "and that's a problem for that person." "It's a significant problem, yes." Price, from his bed. "Who was the M.O. on transfer?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was different from anything she'd seen from him in the last week. No performance, no social positioning, just a question from a man who wanted an answer. She looked at the chart, at the signature on the transfer form. The name was not one she recognized from any Block 7 documentation she'd reviewed, but the rank was, and the unit designation was, and the date of the transfer matched the date that Calloway and his team had arrived, which meant this wasn't a gap in some other patient's documentation. It was a gap in the documentation for the entire Block 7 intake, all 7 of them. She stood very still for a moment. Then she pulled up the admission records for each patient on the ward, not just Oakes, all of them, and cross-referenced the transfer documentation against the intake screening protocols that Coastal Pines required for all Block 7 admissions. The cardiac screening that should have been flagged for Oakes, the secondary blast assessment that should have been documented for Faro and 615, the spinal clearance protocol that had been marked as completed for Beale, but whose supporting documentation didn't match the timeline. Someone had rushed the intake process. Not on the Coastal Pines side. She could see clearly where the facility's own admission staff had followed protocol correctly based on the documentation they'd received. The gap was upstream. The transfer paperwork had been incomplete in ways that were individually subtle but collectively significant, and whoever had signed off on it had either not noticed or had chosen not to flag it. She looked at the signature again. Lieutenant Commander Victor Slade, Medical Officer, Joint Special Operations Support Cell, Tidewater Region. She had never heard the name. She was going to need to. She closed the chart and looked at Holt and Price. "Get some sleep," she said, "both of you." She left before either of them could ask the question she could see forming on Holt's face. It was after 9 when she found Vaughn. He was in the small conference room adjacent to the main nursing station, the one used for case reviews, with his aide and a printed copy of something she couldn't read from the doorway. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put the chart copies she'd made on the table. He looked at them, looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She went through it in the same organized, sequential way she'd given Nambiar the assessment, what she'd found, when she'd found it, what the pattern suggested, and whose signature was on the documentation. She was thorough, and she was specific, and she did not speculate beyond what the evidence supported. When she finished, Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. His aide, she noticed, had stopped making notes and was just watching. "Victor Slade," Vaughn said. "You know him." It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. "He's been the medical officer for the Joint Support Cell for 14 months, Vaughn said. "Before that, he was at a facility in the Pacific Northwest. He came with good evaluations." A pause that had weight in it. He also came with a relationship with a procurement contractor that was flagged during a routine financial review 6 weeks ago, but hadn't yet been elevated to a formal investigation. She looked at him. A procurement contractor that supplies medical equipment and pharmaceutical stock to facilities like this one, Vaughn said. The financial irregularity involved billing discrepancies across several intake cycles. Specifically, discrepancies that were easier to conceal if the intake documentation for incoming patients was simplified. The pieces arranged themselves. He was cutting corners on transfer documentation to cover gaps in the supply records, she said. If the intake screening requirements were fully documented, it would show exactly what supplies and equipment were supposed to be used and when, and that would make it harder to bill for supplies that were never ordered. That's the working theory, Vaughn said. It was a theory with limited evidence 6 weeks ago. He looked at the chart copies. It has considerably more evidence now. She thought about Oakes on the floor of room 614. She thought about the 40 seconds between when he dropped and when she'd found the chart gap. She thought about the specific arithmetic of how close the margin had been. How many patient intakes has Slade processed in 14 months? She asked. Vaughn looked at his aide. The aide said, 63 documented transfers across the Block 7 equivalent units in this region. She let that number sit for a moment. 63, she said. We don't know how many have gaps equivalent to Oakes's, Vaughn said. That's going to require a full audit. He looked at her steadily. Which is going to happen, starting tomorrow. She pushed the chart copies across the table. I'll write up everything I found tonight, she said. Full documentation, time-stamped. You'll have it by midnight. I'd appreciate that. She stood. One more thing, he said. She stopped. The proposal I made earlier, about the specialist role. He looked at the chart copies. What you just did, finding that documentation gap in the middle of managing a patient emergency, that is exactly the function the role is designed for. Someone who can see both sides of the clinical picture, the field side and the institutional side. He paused. I want you to think about it seriously. I am thinking about it seriously. Good. She went to the overflow station, opened a documentation form, and wrote for the next hour and 40 minutes. She was thorough in a way that left no interpretive room, dates, times, specific notations, the precise language of what the transfer documents contained and what they omitted, and the clinical consequences of those omissions as evidenced by Oakes's presentation. She finished at 11:52. She sent the file to Vaughn's secure contact. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet station and thought about Victor Slade, who she had never met, and about the 63 patients, and about the specific kind of harm that happens when someone decides that institutional convenience is worth more than the people the institution is supposed to protect. The audit began the following morning, not quietly. There was no version of what Vaughn had set in motion that was going to be quiet, because the moment the Naval Inspector General's office was contacted, which happened at 7:15, before most of the Block 7 staff had arrived for the day shift, the institutional machinery acquired its own momentum. Delia came in at 6:45 out of habit and found the conference room occupied by people she hadn't seen before, with laptops and document boxes and the particular focused energy of people who had driven in early because they'd been told there was something to find. She went to check on Calloway first. He was awake, which she'd expected. His monitors were steady. He looked at her face when she came in and said, How bad? 63 patients, she said. Potentially, they're auditing now. He closed his eyes briefly. Oakes, he said. Cardiac unit. Nambiar ran the echo this morning at 5. Moderate contusion, no arterial involvement. He's going to be fine, but he'll need 4 to 6 weeks of restricted activity and a full cardiological follow-up. He'll hate that. He's already complaining, apparently. Nambiar considers that a positive sign. Something shifted in Calloway's expression. Not relief exactly. More like the specific release of tension that comes when you've been holding a calculation open in the back of your mind for days, and it finally resolves. And you? He said. I'm returning to full rotation today. Vaughn confirmed it at midnight. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. I'm okay, she said. You found a significant documentation fraud, managed 3 critical patients at an external site, handled Oakes's cardiac event, and wrote a 2-hour documentation report all in the same 12-hour period. It was closer to 14 hours. Delia. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, which she didn't usually do. She sat in it and looked at the monitor screen for a moment, watching the green numbers, and thought about what an honest answer to his question looked like. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm angry about Slade, and about Oakes, and about the other 62 patients who may have been put at risk by someone who was cutting corners on their intake documentation to cover a billing fraud. I'm angry in a way that feels productive rather than destructive, which I recognize is a relatively fortunate form of anger." She paused. "And I'm going to be fine." Calloway looked at her for a moment. "The role Vaughn offered you," he said. She glanced at him. "He told me about it," Calloway said. "Last night before the Oaks situation. He wanted my perspective." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought you were exactly the right person for it, and that if he didn't make the offer concrete very quickly, someone else would eventually figure out you existed and make it first." He said it without sentiment, the way you say things that are simply true. "I also told him that you would probably say you needed time to think about it, and that the thinking wouldn't actually take as long as you'd claim." She looked at the monitor screen. She looked at her hands. She thought about the overflow station, and the administrative leave, and the 5 days of sitting in institutional limbo while a formal complaint ran its course. She thought about carrying credentials that didn't tell the full story because the full story was sealed, and the specific exhaustion of knowing exactly what you were capable of and having no mechanism to prove it that didn't require someone with a high enough clearance to vouch for you. She thought about Ferris at the training facility the night before, about his 30-second assessment, about the way he'd looked at her after the surgeon's acknowledgement. "I'll need to see the role description in writing," she said. Calloway said nothing. He just looked mildly satisfied, which was as close as she'd ever seen him come to smiling. She stood up. "Morning rounds," she said. "Of course." She was at the door when she heard the change in the building. Not a sound, a pressure shift, the kind she'd noticed before when significant rank arrived. But this was different from Vaughn's arrival 2 days ago. This was larger. More voices in the atrium, footsteps in a corridor that was usually quieter at this hour. She stepped out into the Block 7 hallway. At the far end, 3 men in suits were speaking with Gerald Fitch, who had the expression of someone who had been arrived upon rather than prepared for. 2 of the suits had credential badges that she could see from 40 feet were not standard hospital access badges. The third man was on a phone and not looking at Fitch at all. Inspector General's office, she thought, moving faster than Vaughn had suggested. She watched for a moment, then went to do her rounds. Farrow in 615 was doing crosswords and complained that his coffee was cold. Beale was awake and asking about his discharge timeline. She noted the secondary blast assessment gap in Beale's documentation, photographed it with the secure camera function on her credential device, and added it to the audit file she'd started the night before. In 614, Price was asleep. Holt was not. He was sitting up with the particular wakefulness of someone who had not slept well, which she suspected was connected to the events of the previous evening and to whatever internal recalibration he was still working through. "How's your shoulder?" she asked. "Fine." She checked it anyway. It was in fact fine. Better than fine, actually, progressing ahead of the projected timeline, which was consistent with what she'd seen from him physically since admission. Whatever else Ryan Holt was, his body healed fast. "The guys in suits," he said while she was noting the range of motion improvement. "In the main corridor." "Inspector General's office," she said. "Probably. Because of the documentation thing you found." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the complaint I filed." She finished the notation and put the chart down. "I said my piece about that," she said. "It's done." "I know. I want to say something that's not the formal apology I already gave, which was—" He stopped, ran a hand over his face. "I mean what I said then. But I want to say specifically that the thing I was most wrong about wasn't the tattoo. It was the assumption that someone who looked the way you look, in the role you're in, couldn't have been somewhere, couldn't have done something that I'd respect." She looked at him. He looked back at her without deflecting from it. I make that assumption, he said, more than I should, and it's a problem in my thinking. Yes, she said. It is. He absorbed that without flinching. Thank you for being straight about it, he said. You were straight about it first, she said. That counts. She moved to the door. Marsh, he said. She stopped. Oakes is going to be okay? He's going to be okay. He nodded once. She left. The suits were still in the corridor. She walked past them toward the conference room, where Vaughn had reappeared with his aide and a second uniformed officer she hadn't seen before. A woman, commander's insignia, with the specific bearing of someone from the legal division. Delia, Vaughn said. This is Commander Petra Walsh, JAG. She's going to need your documentation from last night. Walsh looked at her with the direct evaluative attention of someone who processes people quickly. I've been briefed on your findings, Walsh said. I have a few questions. Of course, Delia said. They sat down. Walsh asked her questions for 40 minutes. They were good questions, specific, non-leading, designed to establish the precise chain of discovery rather than to build a narrative. Delia answered them the same way she'd written the documentation. Sequentially, specifically, without editorializing. At the end, Walsh looked at her notes and then at Delia. The financial irregularity that triggered the original review of Slade, Walsh said. The procurement discrepancy. Do you know what specifically he was doing with the fraudulent billing? I inferred it from what Vaughn told me, Delia said. Overbilling for supplies against intake processes that he was leaving underdocumented. So the supply records showed expenses for screenings and procedures that the stripped-down documentation didn't account for. That's correct, Walsh said. Across 63 patient intakes over 14 months, the preliminary estimate is approximately $340,000 in fraudulent procurement claims. She said it flat, without inflection. The more significant legal exposure, however, is the patient harm potential. 6 of the 63 patients had medical histories that, under proper screening protocols, would have flagged additional assessments that they didn't receive. 6. Oakes had been one of them. Delia thought about the other 5, about the ones who hadn't dropped in the middle of a hospital room with a nurse who happened to find the chart gap at the right moment. Where's Slade now? She asked. His commanding officer contacted him this morning at 0630, Walsh said. He was placed on administrative hold pending formal investigation. She paused. He requested an attorney. She said it without commentary, but the statement itself was its own commentary. The formal charges, Delia said. What's the timeline? The preliminary Article 32 hearing will be within 30 days. Given the documentation you provided and the audit findings, the case is not expected to be complicated. Walsh looked at her steadily. Your written account is likely to be a central exhibit. Delia nodded. Walsh gathered her materials. One more thing, she said, standing. The documentation gap you found in Oakes's transfer form. You found it in under an hour, in the middle of a patient emergency, after a 14-hour shift that had included an external trauma response. Delia waited. How? Walsh said. It wasn't skepticism. It was genuine curiosity. I was looking for it, Delia said. Not specifically. I didn't know there was a gap. But the blunt trauma notation in his history didn't have a follow-up line, and that's the kind of thing I notice. Missing follow-ups. Incomplete chains. That's a specific skill, Walsh said. It's an old habit, Delia said. Walsh nodded once, snapped her briefcase closed, and left. The conference room was quiet. Vaughn was watching her. She's right, he said. It's a specific skill. I know, Delia said, which brings us back to the proposal. It does, she said. She looked at the table for a moment, at the blank space where her documentation had been before Walsh collected it, at her own hands resting on the table's surface. She thought about what it meant to do work that you knew was exactly the right work, in a context that used the full scope of what you were, without having to spend energy on the gap between what you could demonstrate and what you were actually capable of. She thought about Ferris calling for guidance instead of acting beyond his scope, and being right to do so. She thought about Okoro's hands steadying during the fasciotomy. She thought about Devro's next breath. She thought about Oak's saying not just from the floor of room 614. "I want it in writing," she said. "Full role description, scope of practice, clearance requirements, reporting structure, and a clause confirming that my service record is part of my permanent credential file going forward." Vaughn almost smiled. "I'll have the draft to you by end of business," he said. "I'll review it tonight." She stood, pushed in her chair, and picked up her medication cart from outside the door, where Torres had left it for morning rounds. She had 4 patients to check, 2 documentation updates to file, and a follow-up call to make to the cardiac unit about Oakes's echo results. She started the cart moving down the corridor. Behind her, in the conference room, she heard Vaughn say something quietly to his aide. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She was almost at the far end of the corridor when Gerald Fitch came out of a side door with the expression of a man who had been managing several conversations simultaneously for the last 3 hours and was running slightly behind all of them. He stopped when he saw her. "Delia," he said, I was going to find you this morning, about the review closure, and about," he paused, "repositioned. The last week was handled poorly on the institutional side. I want to acknowledge that directly." She looked at him. He was uncomfortable, and he was being honest about it, which she gave him credit for. "The complaint process exists for a reason," she said. "You ran it correctly given the information you had." "You ran it correctly," she said again, not unkindly. "What happens going forward is what matters." He nodded. Looked like he wanted to say something else, then decided not to. She moved the cart past him. Down the corridor, through the morning light that was coming in at a lower angle than it would in summer, she could see the door to Calloway's room. Past that, the window at the end of the hall showing a gray Maryland sky with the particular flat quality that preceded weather. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from an unknown number that she recognized as Warren Lyles. "Heard about last night. Good work. Also, saw the IG filing. Slade's going to have a very bad month." She put the phone away. Continued down the corridor. The cart's left front wheel had a slight wobble that it had always had, ever since she'd first picked it up 2 weeks after starting at Coastal Pines, and she'd never gotten it fixed because it wasn't worth the paperwork, and she'd learned to compensate for it without thinking. It made a particular uneven sound on the linoleum that she'd stopped noticing months ago. She noticed it now, briefly. Then she stopped noticing it again. She knocked on Calloway's door, opened it, checked his monitor without making ceremony of it, and found his eyes already open and on her face with the calm, measuring attention that had characterized every interaction she'd had with him since the first night. "Vaughn's having the role description drafted," she said. "I know," he said. "He texted me." "Of course he did." She started her check. "You're going to take it," Calloway said. "I said I needed to read the document first." "You're going to take it." She noted his blood pressure, better than yesterday, better than all week, and made the notation without responding. Outside in the corridor, she heard the sound of the IG investigators moving toward the document storage area, voices low and purposeful. The sound of institutional consequence arriving for Victor Slade with the slow, specific weight of a thing that had been building for 14 months and had now finally found its direction. She thought about 63 patients. She thought about Oakes. She thought about the 5 others Walsh had mentioned whose missed screenings were now being located and reviewed, one by one, in a process that would take weeks and would be uncomfortable for everyone involved in the original intake and would produce, at the end, a formal record of harm done and consequence assigned. She thought about the fact that none of that would have been findable last week, because last week she was in the overflow station on administrative leave and had no reason to be reviewing Block 7's transfer documentation. And the only reason she'd been looking at Oakes's chart at all was because he dropped in front of her at exactly the right moment, chance and proximity, and the specific habit of looking for missing follow-up lines. "Calloway," she said. He looked at her. "When you sent that message to the coordination office, the one that got to Lyle, what made you do it then?" You'd been watching me for 3 days before you made the call." He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "The way you left," he said, "after they put you on administrative leave. You came and checked my monitor through the window in the door, and then you walked to the elevator." A pause. "You weren't angry. You weren't performing composure. You were just doing the next thing. In a situation that was genuinely unjust, you were just doing the next thing." She looked at him. "That kind of person," he said, "doesn't usually have anyone making calls on their behalf, because they're too busy doing the next thing to make the calls themselves." She thought about that for a moment. Then she finished the chart notation, wished him a good morning, and went to do the rest of her rounds. She was 3 doors from the end of the corridor. Almost at the window, the gray sky bright now, with the particular flat brightness that meant clouds rather than sun, when her phone buzzed again. Not Lyle this time. An email notification, Coastal Pines internal system, flagged urgent. She opened it. The sender was the hospital's credentialing office. The subject line, Record Amendment, Marsh, Delia R. She stopped walking, opened the email. It was the formal notification that her service record amendment had been processed and attached to her permanent credential file. Below the notification was a document attachment, her service record, partially declassified, with the unit designation and rank and commendation notations that had been sealed for 11 years now visible in plain text. Lieutenant Delia Marsh, Combat Medical Specialist, Special Operations Extraction Unit, Paktia Province. 2 commendations. 1 for the operation itself. 1 for the specific action in the second phase of the mission, when 3 operators had been cut off from the extraction route, and she had stayed under direct fire to treat 2 of them long enough for the 3rd to get into position to suppress the threat. She stood in the corridor and read the commendation language. Demonstrated exceptional medical competence and personal courage under direct fire. Actions directly contributed to the survival of 2 operators. Recommended for commendation at the unit level and noted for extraordinary performance under combat conditions. The language was formal and compressed in the way military documentation always was. It described 2 hours of the worst night of her life in 43 words. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she put her phone away and continued to the end of the corridor. The window showed the gray Maryland sky. Below it, in the courtyard, a few people were moving between buildings with their collars up against the cold. Normal hospital morning. Patients and staff and the ambient machinery of a facility doing what it was built to do. She turned around. Block 7 stretched back toward her. The doors, the nursing station, the light under Gerald Fitch's office door at the far administrative end. The particular quality of a hallway that she knew now by sound and light, and the specific way the left front wheel of the medication cart tracked on the linoleum. She picked up the cart handle. She had 3 more patients to see, 2 documentation updates, and a call to make. She started walking. Behind her, in a conference room she couldn't see, Commander Petra Walsh was reading a preliminary list of the 63 patient files flagged for audit review, and the number next to Victor Slade's name was growing with each folder that came out of the document storage boxes. And in a side building of the Naval Station complex on the Tidewater waterfront, in a small office with no window, a lieutenant commander named Victor Slade was sitting across from a uniformed legal officer, and the particular expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been very careful for 14 months, and had now understood, in the space of a single morning, exactly where the careful had stopped being enough. He didn't know about Delia Marsh yet. He didn't know that the documentation gap that had unraveled his 14 months of careful work had been found by a nurse in a Block 7 overflow station at 11 o'clock at night during a patient emergency because she had a habit of looking for missing follow-up lines. He was about to find out. The legal officer across from him placed a single document on the table between them, a time-stamped file, 61 pages, with a cover notation that read, Primary Discovery Documentation, Marsh, Dr. Slade looked at the cover page. Then he looked up at the legal officer, and the legal officer said, with the flat, specific patience of someone who has done this many times, Lieutenant Commander Slade, I'd like to begin. Slade looked at the cover page for a long time, not reading it. He'd understood what it was in the first 2 seconds. The looking was something else. The particular stillness of a man whose internal architecture was rearranging itself around a new reality, finding where the load-bearing walls had been and discovering they were gone. The legal officer waited. She had learned through experience that this moment was better served by silence than by pressure. The document on the table was doing the work. 61 pages, Slade finally said. That's the primary file. The supporting audit documentation is an additional 212 pages compiled over the last 18 hours. She said it without inflection. We can go through the primary file first. He said nothing. Lieutenant Commander, she said, I'd recommend you contact your attorney before we proceed further. He had already called one. The attorney was on his way from a firm in Annapolis that handled military legal matters and had probably been woken at an inconvenient hour. The legal officer knew this. She was telling him again because she wanted it on record that the advisement had been given twice. Who found it? He said. She looked at the cover notation, at the name printed there. A nurse, she said. He looked up. At Coastal Pines, she said, during a patient emergency. She was reviewing a transfer form and found a missing follow-up line in a cardiac screening notation. He stared at her. One missing line, he said. One missing line, she confirmed, in Specialist Oakes's intake documentation, which cross-referenced to 5 additional gaps in the same transfer batch, which cross-referenced to the procurement records, which, as you're aware, leads where it leads. He put his hands flat on the table. He did not speak again until his attorney arrived 37 minutes later. By then, the audit had expanded to include procurement records from the previous fiscal year, supply invoices from 2 additional facilities under Slade's administrative oversight, and a secondary financial review flagged by the IG office that suggested the $340,000 estimate was conservative by somewhere in the range of $60,000 to $90,000. The attorney arrived, reviewed the primary file in 12 minutes, and said to his client in a voice low enough that the legal officer could technically claim she hadn't heard, "Do not say another word." Slade didn't, but his hand stayed flat on the table, and his face had the look of a man understanding, in real time, that the careful architecture of 14 months was not going to survive the week. At Coastal Pines, the morning moved the way mornings do when something significant is happening in one part of a building and the rest of the building has to keep functioning anyway. Delia finished her rounds. She filed the documentation updates. She called the cardiac unit about Oakes's echo results and spoke to the attending cardiologist, a measured, precise woman named Dr. Adeze Obi, who confirmed moderate myocardial contusion with no arterial involvement, projected 4 to 6 weeks of restricted duty, and said in a tone that suggested she'd been made aware of the broader context. Whoever flagged this when they did probably saved him a significantly worse outcome. He flagged himself, Delia said. I just found the chart. A pause. That's a generous read, Dr. Obi said. It's the accurate one. She put the phone down and went to restock the medication cart. Addie found her in the supply room at 10:40. I heard about Slade, Addie said. She had a granola bar but wasn't eating it, which meant she was more focused than usual. What did you hear? Enough. The IG people have been in and out of the records room all morning. Someone from administration told someone in the pharmacy who told me. She paused. 63 patients? That's what the preliminary audit shows. Addie was quiet for a moment. Oakes could have been much worse, she said. Yes. And you found it because you were looking at his chart in the middle of the emergency. I was looking at it because the blunt trauma notation didn't have a follow-up. Missing follow-ups bother me. I know, Addie said. I've watched you catch 3 of them in 4 years. I thought it was just a quirk. She looked at Delia. It's not a quirk. Delia put the last supply item on the cart. No, she said. It's not. She moved the cart out of the supply room. Addie fell into step beside her for a few paces, then peeled off toward the main nursing station. For what it's worth, Addie said over her shoulder, the night staff is planning something. I was told to tell you it's unavoidable and resistance is futile. What kind of something? The kind with food and a card that everyone's been signing since yesterday. Delia looked at her. Tonight, Addie said. Break room, 7:30. Don't be somewhere else. She disappeared around the corner. Delia pushed the cart down the corridor and thought about the specific discomfort of being celebrated, which had always felt slightly worse than being ignored. She understood, intellectually, that it was important to the people doing it. She had just never found a comfortable place to stand inside it. She was still thinking about that when she turned the corner and nearly walked into Ryan Holt. He was in the hallway in hospital socks and a gown, standing upright with a better shoulder posture than she'd seen from him all week, which told her his recovery was ahead of schedule, even if he was currently violating protocols by being out of his room unescorted. "You're not supposed to be in the corridor," she said. "I know." He held up a hand before she could continue. I wanted to catch you before Oakes gets back, before there's an audience." She stopped the cart. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "I've been going back and forth about what to say," he said. "I had something drafted in my head last night that sounded right at 2 a.m. and now sounds like garbage." A pause. "So I'm just going to say the simple thing." She waited. "I put your job in danger because I assumed I understood something I didn't understand," he said. "Not because of bad information, because of a bad habit I have of deciding what things are before I've actually looked at them." He said it carefully, like a man who has worked out the exact words and is making sure they come out right. "Oakes almost died last night because of a documentation gap that you caught. You caught it because you were doing your job. You were doing your job after I spent 4 days trying to make sure you couldn't." He looked at her steadily. "That's a specific kind of wrong. I don't have a better word for it." She looked at him. "You already apologized," she said. "The first one was the formal version. This is the one I actually mean." She considered that for a moment. "It's a bad habit worth breaking," she said. "The deciding before looking." "I know, I'm working on it." A pause. "Apparently I have 4 to 6 more weeks of recovery time to practice." "Oakes is the one with 6 weeks. You might be out in 3. Assuming I stop walking around corridors against medical advice." "That would help, yes." Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not a smile, but the ghost of the possibility of one. "Thank you," he said, "for Oakes. Go back to your room, petty officer." He went. She pushed the cart forward and let out a slow breath and thought that sometimes the hardest thing to know what to do with was not hostility, but its eventual absence. The formal charges against Victor Slade were filed at 2:17 that afternoon. Delia found out not from Vaughn or Walsh or anyone in the official chain, but from a terse email notification sent to her as primary documentation source by the IG office, informing her that the case had been formally opened and that she might be contacted for additional testimony at a later date. She read it at the overflow station, set her phone down, picked it back up. The charges, as summarized in the notification, were fraudulent procurement billing, negligent documentation management resulting in patient harm risk, and conduct unbecoming an officer, the last charge covering the financial relationship with the contractor that had started the whole chain. The potential consequences, listed in the formal language of military legal process, included forfeiture of pay and allowances, dismissal from service, and depending on the final assessment of harm, possible referral for criminal prosecution under the Uniform Code. $340,000, trending higher. 6 patients with unscreened medical histories. 14 months. She thought about the procurement contractor, about the billing cycles, about the specific decision someone had made, probably not dramatically, probably not with a clear sense of the harm it would produce, to handle intake documentation in a way that kept the numbers convenient, the small, compounding choices that add up to something catastrophic in retrospect. She thought about Oakes's face on the floor, the color of it. She put the phone away. She had the role description document from Vaughn sitting in her email, received at 3 minutes past noon, 58 pages plus appendices. She hadn't read it yet. She opened it. She read for 40 minutes, making notes in the margin of a legal pad she kept in the overflow station for exactly this kind of reading. The role was genuinely what Vaughn had described. Not a physician's role, not a standard nursing role, but a specific specialist position that bridged the gap between field medical experience and institutional trauma care. Embedded at Block 7 equivalent facilities, clearance requirements at the level that her newly reinstated access profile covered, Reporting structure directly to Naval Special Warfare Medical Command, with a dotted line to Facility Administration. The scope of practice clause was written carefully, specifically, in language that had clearly been reviewed by someone who understood the tension between what she was trained to do and what standard nursing credentials authorized her to do in a facility setting. It addressed the tension directly, rather than pretending it didn't exist, which she respected. The clause about her service record was in Section 4, Paragraph 3. Medical Specialist Service Designation, rank at separation, and commendation record shall be reflected in permanent credential documentation maintained by the facility and by Naval Special Warfare Medical Command. Classification restrictions on operational details remain in effect per original security agreement. She read that paragraph twice. She wrote one word on the legal pad. Yes. Then she went back to work. Oakes came back to Block 7 at 4:15. He was in a wheelchair. Not because he couldn't walk, Dr. Obi had said, but because protocol required it for cardiac unit discharges, regardless of the patient's opinion on the matter. And Oakes had apparently made his opinion on the matter extremely clear and been overruled. Delia was doing a chart update at the main nursing station when the elevator opened and Oakes came around the corner being pushed by a cardiac unit orderly who had the expression of someone who had been listening to strong opinions for the last 30 minutes. Behind the wheelchair, Ryan Holt was walking, slowly, carefully, managing his shoulder with the kind of deliberate attention that told her he'd come down to the elevator lobby on his own and nobody on staff had caught him doing it. She looked at Holt. He shrugged the shoulder that could shrug. Oakes looked at her from the wheelchair. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," she said. Dr. Obi's echo confirms it. "Then can I get out of this chair?" "When you're back in your room." That's what the cardiac unit said. They were right. He made a sound that was not quite a word, but conveyed a clear position on being agreed with by multiple medical professionals. She walked beside the wheelchair down the corridor, checked the room, confirmed the monitor setup that Torres had arranged, and watched Oakes transfer from the wheelchair to the bed, with the careful, slightly frustrated movements of a man whose body is cooperating better than he expected, and who is obscurely annoyed by this. 4 to 6 weeks, she said. Obi said 4 to 6 weeks. And I'm saying 4 to 6 weeks. How do you know? Because I found the chart gap that identified the condition, and because I've been watching your recovery patterns for a week, and because cardiac contusion at your level of presentation with no arterial involvement and immediate intervention has a well-documented recovery trajectory. He looked at her. 4 weeks, he said. We'll see. You think 5? I think we'll see. Holt, who had come in behind them and lowered himself into the chair beside his own bed with deliberate care, said, She thinks 5. She's being diplomatic. Stay out of it, Oakes said. I'm just translating. Price, who had been reading and not participating, said without looking up, Both of you stop. You sound like you're 12. The room went briefly quiet. Delia looked at Price. This was the first extended thing she'd heard him say in 2 days that wasn't monosyllabic. Your dressing needs to be changed this afternoon, she said to him. He looked up. I know, he said. I was going to ask about that. There was something different in his face. The social maneuvering she'd noticed from the first day, the positioning, the following of Holt's lead, was absent, or at least quieter. 4 o'clock, she said. I'll come back. He nodded. She left the room. At 7:30, she went to the break room because Addie had said resistance was futile, and she believed her. It was the night staff, mostly, Torres and 2 of the overnight aides and a nurse named Regan, who worked the late rotation on the floor below and had apparently heard about the situation through the hospital's efficient informal network. Addie was there. Dr. Nambiar had stopped in on her way out, still in her coat. Gerald Fitch had sent a card but had the self-awareness not to attend in person, which Delia considered the right call. There was food. Someone had made a considerable effort with the food. She stood in the break room and ate something and accepted the card, which had been signed by more people than she'd expected and contained, in Addie's handwriting near the bottom, the words, You were always doing your job. We just needed to say we noticed. She read it once, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket. Nambiar caught her eye from across the room. "The Oaks case is going to be a teaching case," Nambiar said quietly, when they were briefly in the same corner. "Cardiac contusion with delayed presentation in a high-fitness patient. I'm writing it up for the facility's case review." "I'd like to read it before it goes out," Delia said. "I want to make sure the timeline is accurate." "I'll send you the draft." Nambiar paused. "You identified the mechanism in under a minute." "I had context from the chart." "Everyone had access to the chart," Nambiar said. "You're the one who looked." She didn't have a clean response to that, so she didn't make one. The evening wound down the way those things do, gradually, then all at once, people drifting back to their shifts or their commutes. Addie was the last to leave and paused in the doorway. "You good?" she said. "Yes," Delia said. Addie looked at her for a moment with the specific evaluative attention of someone who knows the difference between yes and "I'm going to say yes." "Okay," Addie said. "See you tomorrow." She left. Delia sat in the empty break room for a few minutes. She thought about the last 9 days. She arranged them in her mind the way she'd always organized complicated things, sequentially, without editorial weight on any individual element, just the chain of it. The admission, the tattoo, the complaint, the administrative leave, Calloway's emergency, Lyle's call, Vaughn's arrival, the training facility, Oaks on the floor, the chart gap, Slade's name on the transfer form, the 61-page file on a table in an office across the waterfront. 11 years of carrying a service record that didn't exist in any system she could point to, and a tattoo that represented 3 people who hadn't made it out of a valley in Paktia province, and the specific daily discipline of doing work she knew was the right work in a context that couldn't fully see what she was. And then one sleeve slipping, and a man with bad assumptions and a loud voice deciding he knew what the mark meant. She thought about the fact that if Holt hadn't filed the complaint, she wouldn't have been in the overflow station on administrative leave. If she hadn't been in the overflow station, she wouldn't have been the one reviewing Block 7's transfer documentation with the particular focused attention of someone with nothing else to do. If she hadn't been doing that, she would have responded to Oakes's emergency as the duty nurse on his case, rather than as someone who had just spent 2 days reading every piece of paper associated with his admission. She would have stabilized him. She would have done her job correctly, because that was what she did. But she might not have been looking at the chart at that exact moment. She might not have caught the missing line until later, or not at all, or not with enough time for the outcome to be what it was. The things you can't unknow once you know them. She sat with that for a while. Then she stood up, threw away the paper plate, put the leftover food in the refrigerator because it was good food and someone would want it tomorrow, turned off the break room light, and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Victor Slade accepted a plea agreement. The agreement included full forfeiture of pay and allowances from the date of the initial fraud, dismissal from military service with a dishonorable characterization, repayment of $411,000 in fraudulent procurement claims, the final audit number, higher than either estimate, and cooperation with the ongoing investigation into the procurement contractor, who was facing separate civil and criminal exposure. No prison sentence, because the attorney had been good, and the cooperation had been genuine, and the legal officer had determined that the cooperation value outweighed the incarceration argument. But the dismissal was dishonorable, which in the world Slade had built his career in was its own specific permanent consequence. His medical license was referred to the state board for review. The board completed its review in 11 days and suspended it pending a formal hearing that was not expected to produce a reinstatement. His name appeared in an internal Naval Inspector General report that was not public but was accessible to any credentialing body that requested it. He did not contest any of it. Commander Walsh called Delia to inform her of the agreement's terms. "The 6 patients with missed screenings," Delia said. "What happens to them?" "All 6 have been contacted. 4 have completed the supplemental screenings already. 1 is scheduled, 1 is overseas, and the coordination is ongoing." Walsh paused. "All 4 completed screenings came back clean, for what it's worth." "What about the one who's overseas?" "We're working with his unit's medical officer. He'll be screened in country within the next 2 weeks." Delia sat with that. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," Walsh said, in a tone that indicated she meant it specifically rather than reflexively. Calloway was discharged on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after his admission. He'd been walking the corridor for a week, and the oxygen readings had been textbook for the last 10 days. And Dr. Keller had run out of clinical reasons to keep him and said so with the tone of a man who recognized he was losing an interesting patient. Delia did his discharge check herself. She went through the protocol: vitals, wound assessment, medication review, follow-up documentation, with the same systematic attention she brought to every discharge, which meant it took longer than the abbreviated version some nurses used but produced paperwork that wouldn't cause problems downstream. He watched her work with the same calm, measuring attention he'd had from the first night. "You signed the role acceptance," he said. It wasn't a question. "Last week. Vaughn told me. He tells you everything. He tells me what he thinks I should know." A pause. "I think he was nervous you were going to decline." "I almost did." "Why?" She finished the wound assessment and made the notation. "Because saying yes to something like this means staying in a specific place long enough to build something," she said. "And I haven't. I've moved a lot. Since the unit dissolved, I've moved and changed roles and kept things at a certain level of impermanence." She looked at the chart. "It was easier." "Easier than what?" "Than being somewhere that uses all of you. Because when something uses all of you, there's more to lose." He was quiet for a moment. "Oaks could have died," he said. "Yes." "And you were there." "Yes." "Because you stayed." She looked at him. He held her gaze without elaborating because he'd made the point and he knew she'd followed it, and he was not the kind of man who restated things for effect. She finished the discharge documentation. "Follow up at the Naval Medical Center in 2 weeks," she said. "The pulmonary function appointment is already scheduled. Don't skip it." "I won't." "And the physical therapy protocol?" "I have it," he said. "I read it this morning." She put the chart in the discharge folder and held it out. He took it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was straightforward, in the specific way that serious people are sometimes straightforward. No performance, no softening, just the direct acknowledgement of something real. "You're exactly where you should be," he said. She thought about 11 years. About sealed records and faded tattoos and overflow nursing stations and medication carts with a wobble in the left front wheel. About a valley in Paktia province and 3 names she carried on her arm in a code that wasn't standard issue. About Oakes's next breath after the drain went in. About the look on Ferris's face in the amber light of an emergency site in Anne Arundel County, when the surgeon had said good work, and Ferris had looked at her rather than at the surgeon. "I know," she said. Calloway nodded once. He picked up his bag, which someone had brought from storage, neatly packed, handled with the same care the Block 7 staff applied to everything that belonged to the people in their charge, and walked to the door. He paused, didn't turn around. "The 3, he said, "on the tattoo. What were their names?" She hadn't told anyone that, not in 11 years. The names were in the sealed operational record, and in her memory, and on nothing else. She told him. 3 names. Said plainly, the way you say things that deserve to be said plainly. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Thank you," he said. He left. She stood in the room for a moment after he was gone. The monitor was off, the bed was stripped. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle it came through at this time of year, long and low, putting a rectangle of pale yellow on the floor near the window. She picked up the discharge folder and walked out. The new role officially began on a Monday. There was no ceremony, no formal announcement to the Block 7 staff beyond a revised duty roster that listed her title differently than it had before. She moved her personal items from the overflow station to the small office that had been designated as her workspace: the water bottle, the legal pad, the pen she'd been using since her second week at Coastal Pines. She sat at the desk for a moment. Then she went to do her rounds. The left front wheel on the medication cart still wobbled. She had submitted a maintenance request for it the previous week, and it had not yet been addressed, which was consistent with her experience of maintenance requests at every facility she'd ever worked in. She compensated for it without thinking. Block 7 had 3 new admissions: a communications specialist with a knee reconstruction, an intelligence officer with secondary infection from a shrapnel wound, and a younger operator, barely 23, who had been in theater for 8 months, and whose physical injuries were healing faster than whatever he'd brought back from those 8 months that didn't show on any scan. She did the comms specialist's vitals, reviewed the intelligence officer's antibiotic protocol, sat with the young operator for 11 minutes without making it a clinical visit, just sat near the window while he looked at the ceiling, because sometimes that was what the work looked like. And she had learned a long time ago that the most important thing you could offer someone who'd been through something difficult was the evidence that another person was willing to be present in the same room with it. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After 11 minutes, she stood and told him his meal tray would come at 6, and that if his shoulder was bothering him more than a 4, he should use the call button rather than waiting for rounds. He looked at her. "Okay," he said. It came out quieter than he probably intended. "Get some rest," she said. She went back to the corridor. She thought about what it meant to do this work for the rest of her professional life. Not as a thing she'd fallen into or settled for or chosen because it was available, but as the specific particular work that used the exact combination of what she was. All of it, the field experience and the clinical training and the 11 years of watching people heal from things that weren't supposed to be survivable. The work that nobody announced from a podium, that didn't produce ceremonies or visible markers of its own importance, that got done in corridors at 2 in the morning and emergency sites and county facilities and break rooms that smelled like recycled air and someone's leftover coffee. That got done by people who showed up and looked at charts and stayed in rooms with patients who needed someone to stay in the room. She pushed the cart to the next door. She knocked. She went in. And somewhere across the Chesapeake Bay waterfront, in a building she would never see, a man named Victor Slade was signing the final paperwork on an agreement that would close out 14 months of choices he could no longer explain in any way that made the math work out differently. The pen moved across the signature line, and the legal officer collected the page, and the attorney gathered his materials, and Slade sat in the chair for a moment after everyone else had stood, and thought about a nurse in an overflow station at 11 o'clock at night who had looked at a chart and found a missing follow-up line. One line. He had cut one line from 63 different forms, and each cut had been so small that it had seemed like nothing each time he made it, and the nothing had added up to something that was going to follow him for the rest of his professional life. He thought about that. Then he stood, because the legal officer was waiting, and he walked out. At Coastal Pines, at 6:10 in the evening, a medication cart with a wobble in its left front wheel moved down the Block 7 corridor. The sound it made was a specific, uneven rhythm. Familiar, unglamorous, completely ordinary. The nurse pushing it had a faded tattoo on her right forearm that most people didn't notice unless the light was at a particular angle, or she reached across someone to adjust a medication line and her sleeve moved. 3 names. A broken blade. A coordinate sequence and a code that wasn't standard issue because it had never been officially sanctioned. She carried it the way she carried everything, without announcement, without the expectation that the weight of it would be visible to anyone who wasn't already looking. Most people weren't looking. That had never been the point. The point was what happened in the space between the moment someone needed help and the moment they got it. The point was staying in the room. The point was the follow-up line you noticed because you were paying attention, and the breath that came easier afterward, and the name that stayed in a sealed record but stayed in your arm too, where it belonged. She pushed the cart to the next door. She knocked. She went in. The work continued. It had always continued. That was the thing about people who did it right. You didn't always see them doing it. You just knew, eventually, that something had been held together that might otherwise have come apart. And when you tried to trace it back to the moment where it had been saved, you found someone who had been there all along, doing the next thing, asking for nothing, carrying more than you knew. She checked the vitals. She made the notation. She moved on.